Hello, my name is Lucille. My own mother told me there was no space for me in the family newsletter, as if my life didn't matter at all. At the Legacy Gala, she snapped in front of everyone, and my sister spilled wine down my dress while guests laughed. My father kept his eyes on his glass, silent as always. I was left trembling in the rain outside their mansion, but what none of them knew was that my grandmother had left me the deed. What happens when the daughter they erased walks back into the ballroom holding the one truth they can't destroy? Christmas Eve in Charleston was always staged like a magazine spread in my family's mansion. My mother insisted on flawless garlands of magnolia leaves along the banister, a grand tree trimmed in gold, and a fire that looked as though it had been painted into the stone hearth. Yet behind all of that southern charm, the atmosphere was colder than the December wind outside. I was 9 that year, old enough to notice details, too young to have the power to change any of them. Above the fireplace hung our family stockings, each monogrammed, each carefully chosen to match the personality of its owner. My brother had a deep green one embroidered with the family crest. My older sister's was made of crimson silk lined with pearls. Even my younger sibling, barely out of diapers, had one decorated with velvet trim. When I stepped closer, I felt my stomach twist. The hook where my stocking should have been was bare. The brass holder gleamed in the firelight, mocking me with its emptiness. I remember searching the hearth for a mistake. Maybe it had fallen behind the woodpile, or maybe someone had set it down while adjusting the mantel. I crouched, hands dusty with soot, scanning every corner as my heart began to pound. "Mother," I whispered, "where's mine?" She barely glanced away from her champagne flute. "The seamstress must have miscounted. Don't fuss." My father chuckled awkwardly, rustling his newspaper. "Guess it slipped through the cracks in the holiday rush." The sound of his laugh was hollow, a poor cover for discomfort. I nodded, though tears stung my eyes. Even as a child, I knew mistakes weren't tolerated in our house. Nothing happened without careful calculation. That missing stocking wasn't an oversight. It was a message. The laughter and music around me only made the silence directed at me sharper. I stood there, staring at the empty hook, trying to swallow the ache that settled in my chest. Years have passed, but that memory is as vivid as the fire's glow on that cold night. People think trauma comes from shouting, from dramatic fights, but it's the quiet omissions, the small exclusions that carve deepest. There's an American saying, "The devil is in the details." That night, the detail was an empty hook above the mantel, a reminder I wasn't counted. Even now, decades later, I can tell you precisely how it shaped me. That single absence became the lens through which I saw every holiday, every dinner, every staged family portrait. It taught me that belonging in my house was conditional, and conditions could change depending on my mother's mood. As I tell you this, I want you to understand, bitterness isn't always loud. Sometimes it sits quietly beside you, like an unwelcome guest who never leaves. I didn't rage at them that night. I didn't dare. Instead, I learned to make myself smaller, to fold my pain into neat corners, as invisible as they preferred me to be. Years later, when I was graduating college, that wound resurfaced in a new shape. It was a warm spring morning in the early 2010s. My friends gathered in gowns, families cheering with balloons and flowers. The air smelled of sunscreen and magnolias, the sun sharp against the bleachers packed with parents holding cameras. I kept scanning the crowd, certain I'd spot my parents' faces, or at least my father's hat tilted against the glare. The longer I searched, the heavier the empty seat beside me felt. As my name was called, I walked across the stage, my diploma pressed into my hand. I smiled because the photographer told me to, not because my heart believed in the moment. Afterward, while friends laughed and hugged their families, I checked my phone. One message blinked on the screen. "We're proud, sweetheart." "Sorry we couldn't make it." It was signed with my father's initials. No call, no explanation, just a text. That message stung worse than their absence. Pride reduced to 12 words and a period. I slid the phone back into my purse, my fingers numb. Later, I saw photographs of my siblings' graduations, lavish parties, announcements in the family newsletter, champagne toasts in glossy spreads. My milestone received silence. A friend approached me, bouquet in hand. "Lucille, where's your family?" she asked kindly, her smile faltering when she noticed I was standing alone. I forced my lips upward. "They couldn't make it, but it's fine," I said, pretending it didn't matter. She gave me a sympathetic pat on the shoulder before running off to pose with her parents. I stayed where I was, clutching my diploma case as though it were an anchor. I didn't cry, not then. I simply felt hollow, as though the seat next to me in the stadium had been carved into my chest. There's a saying I once came across: when you're the invisible one, you learn to clap for yourself. That's exactly what I did that day, applauding inwardly, convincing myself survival was enough. Later, I remembered Maya Angelou's words: "I come as one, but I stand as 10,000. I repeated it like a prayer, not because I believed it fully then, but because I needed to. I needed to believe there was more to me than what my family refused to see. That graduation, like the empty stocking years before, became another stitch in the tapestry of erasure. But it also became a quiet reminder that if I didn't claim myself, no one else ever would. I thought I'd buried those memories, left them to fade, like old photographs tucked in a drawer. But life has a way of circling back, pressing its finger against old scars to remind you they never truly healed. I didn't know it at the time, standing under the sun with my diploma clutched tight, that a single line in a family newsletter years later would reopen everything. I didn't know my mother's words would cut as deep as they did that night by the fire, or that empty seat at my graduation. But I would soon. The glossy envelope arrived on a Thursday afternoon. I remember the faint scent of ink when I slid it open, the smooth texture of the cardstock that my family always prided themselves on. The annual newsletter was supposed to be a celebration, a catalog of achievements, marriages, travels, philanthropy. My mother called it "our family's legacy in print." Neighbors expected it, church friends collected it, and business associates passed it around like it was scripture. I sat at my small kitchen table, coffee cooling in its mug, and unfolded the pages. My eyes traced the ornate headings, golden borders curling like ivy. There was my brother's smiling face, standing with his company at a ribbon-cutting ceremony. There was my sister hosting a charity gala in a sequined gown, her name bold beneath the photograph. Even my youngest sibling, who had barely entered adulthood, had half a page dedicated to his backpacking trip across Europe. Paragraphs of praise, carefully chosen words, polished to shine. I turned each page slowly, waiting for a glimpse of myself, a line, a mention, anything, but the space where my name should have been was blank. No photo, no paragraph, no acknowledgement. It was as though I hadn't lived the year at all. I sat back in my chair, the paper trembling in my hands. Only months earlier, I had told my mother about the art project I had been working on, a community mural with local students, something I was proud of because it wasn't about prestige, but about connection. She had nodded politely at the time, her eyes already drifting to another subject. Now I understood why. It had never been intended to appear in her carefully curated version of the family. My phone sat within reach. Against my better judgment, I dialed her number. She answered on the second ring, her tone brisk as though she had been expecting a business call. "Mother?" I said, my voice steady despite the knot in my chest. "I just got the newsletter." "Yes," she replied. "Doesn't it look beautiful this year?" "There's nothing of me in it," I said plainly. A pause, then her words fell like ice. There was no space for you. I let the silence stretch. I had seen the wide margins, the decorative flourishes, the empty white blocks that could have held a sentence. The paper itself was acres of space. What she meant wasn't about space at all. It was about choice. You had room, I said quietly. Her tone sharpened. Lucille, not every little project needs to be printed for the world to see. It's not about the project, I answered. It's about pretending I don't exist. She exhaled, exasperated. You always make things more dramatic than they are. If you want recognition, then perhaps you should work harder at something that counts. I swallowed hard, the insult landing exactly where she meant it to. But I didn't give her the satisfaction of anger. Space isn't the problem, I said firmly. Choice is. She ended the call without another word. A week later, another envelope arrived. This one smaller, thicker, the invitation to the upcoming Legacy Gala. I held it carefully, almost afraid of what I might find. The outer card gleamed, embossed with the family crest. I opened it, scanning for my name. And there it was, printed in elegant cursive. Lucy Vander. Lucy, not Lucille, not even spelled fully. And Vander, cut short, stripped of its history. For a family obsessed with precision, with flawless presentation, this was no accident. It was another message, crafted with as much intent as the missing stocking years ago. I imagined guests reading the card, wondering who Lucy Vander was. Perhaps assuming I was an assistant or an outsider, certainly not one of them. My mother's handwriting was all over this slight, even if she had not physically typed it. I placed the invitation beside the newsletter on my desk, the two artifacts of erasure staring back at me. Together, they told the story better than words could. I was less than, trimmed away, reshaped to fit their narrative of who belonged and who did not. When people erase you, I murmured aloud, they don't just take away your place. They shrink your very name. I didn't cry. I didn't even feel surprised. Instead, a kind of clarity settled over me. The newsletter, the invitation, these weren't just oversights. They were receipts, proof. And someday, I would lay them bare. I reached for my notebook, sliding the documents inside its pocket. As I did, I recalled Maya Angelou's words. People will forget what you said. People will forget what you did. But people will never forget how you made them feel. My mother had made me feel small, invisible, inconsequential. But she had underestimated me. I whispered to myself, these are not wounds anymore. They are evidence. I didn't storm the estate or call my siblings to demand an apology. That wasn't my way. Instead, I folded the newsletter, smoothed the invitation, and tucked them away. Every slight, every cut would one day stitch into something stronger. The night grew quiet around me. Outside, the streetlights buzzed faintly, and a dog barked in the distance. I leaned back in my chair, arms crossed, my mind sharper than it had felt in years. They told me there was no space for me, I thought. And then they misspelled my name as if to shrink me further. I stood, closing the blinds, and looked once more at the desk where the evidence sat waiting. What they don't realize, I said under my breath, is that they're writing their own downfall in bold ink. The invitation glinted under the lamp. I knew then that it wasn't just a card. It was my ticket to the storm that was about to break. I was in my early teens the first time I discovered the photograph. It was winter, and we had just returned from a ski trip to Colorado, a rare family vacation that was supposed to be about bonding. I remembered the day vividly. I was bundled in oversized gear, my scarf crooked, my smile tentative but genuine. We had all posed together at the bottom of the slope, snow still clinging to our boots. I knew I had been there because I remembered the flash, the way my sister leaned into the center, and the way my father's hand rested firmly on my brother's shoulder. Years later, I was walking down the wide hallway of our Charleston estate. Guests often lingered there, admiring the collection of family portraits and framed photographs. The frames glittered under chandeliers, a curated gallery meant to present us as one united, perfect household. But when I stopped to look at the ski trip photo, my stomach twisted. I wasn't in it. The image showed only my siblings, perfectly balanced, smiling like a magazine spread. I knew the original had included me, yet here in our home, for guests and strangers to see, I had been cropped out. I stared, my pulse racing, heat rising to my cheeks despite the cool air. Someone had deliberately cut me from the picture, chosen to rewrite the memory, and displayed it proudly. It wasn't a mistake. It was an edit, and edits spoke louder than words. It's one thing to be forgotten. It's another to be erased on purpose. For days, I lingered in that hallway when no one was around, staring at the empty space where I should have been. My siblings never noticed, or perhaps they did and chose silence. My mother passed by once, saw me standing there, and said lightly, "That photo looks so much cleaner this way." Cleaner, as if I had been a smudge on the canvas of our family's portrait. The sting of that moment burrowed deep. What's not seen is what's not spoken of, as an old Southern saying goes. By removing me from the image, they weren't just editing a photograph, they were teaching the world and me that I did not matter. I carried that lesson into high school, where it played out again in a different form. One spring, I was asked to write a speech for the school awards banquet. It was an honor, something I had worked hard on. I poured myself into those words, about perseverance, about failure as a teacher, about hope. I practiced in my room, whispering the lines to the mirror. My mother found the pages one evening, read them, and said nothing except, "We'll polish this a little." The night of the banquet, I sat in the audience, heart hammering with anticipation. The principal stepped up, introduced the speaker, and to my shock, it wasn't me who walked on stage. It was my sister. She unfolded the same pages I had written, her voice carrying my words into the microphone. I sat frozen, my breath caught in my chest. She read the speech flawlessly, receiving applause, nods, even tears from the audience. And all the while, I sat invisible, the true author of those lines erased. A friend leaned over, eyes wide, and whispered, "Didn't you write something like that?" I forced a smile, nodding faintly, my throat tight. The applause roared, but it felt like thunder crashing inside me. My words had been good enough for the family's image, good enough to be claimed, but not good enough to bear my name. I wanted to stand, to say, "Those are mine." Instead, I sat still, hands pressed into my lap until my nails left marks in my skin. It was then I understood. They weren't just forgetting me. They were rehearsing how to live without me. Each act of removal was practice for a performance where I never had a role. Looking back, I can see it clearly. The cropped photo, the stolen speech, they weren't isolated moments. They were patterns. My family was scripting a story where I didn't exist, and I had been too quiet, too eager to keep peace, to rip the pages back. History is written by those who edit the photographs. That phrase echoes in my mind still. My family controlled the frames on the wall, the words in the microphone, the space on the page. They had power because they chose what to show and what to hide, and I was what they hid. At the time, I told myself silence was survival. If I stayed quiet, I thought, perhaps I could endure it, slip by unnoticed until I was free. But silence is a hungry thing. It doesn't protect, it consumes. Now, as I hold the newsletter in my hand and stare at the invitation with my name mutilated, I know these were not accidents. They were continuations of a long rehearsal. The cropping, the theft, the omissions, they were all chapters in the same book. And if my family had written me out, I had to find a way to write myself back in. I told myself back then that silence was safety, but I've learned silence only feeds the beast. The newsletter and the wrong name on that invitation dragged these memories to the surface, sharper than ever. The empty space in the photograph, the applause stolen from my voice, they all came rushing back. And I made myself a promise. When the gala came, they would see that the girl they cropped out was still in the frame. When I think back on my father, I picture him always nearby, but never stepping forward. He was present at every dinner, at every holiday, at every staged family photograph. He stood tall in the background, polite to guests, respected in the community, admired for his gentle Southern dignity. But behind closed doors, his dignity was just silence. Silence when my mother dismissed me about the missing stocking. Silence when my speech was stolen and handed to my sister. Silence when my name was erased from the newsletter, as if my life had no place in print. There are silences that heal. The kind when someone sits with you through grief, offering wordless comfort. My father's silence was not that kind. His was heavy, deliberate, protective of someone else, never me. He feared confrontation with my mother more than he feared the wound his silence carved into me. And yet, part of me, maybe the little girl who once searched desperately for her missing stocking, still hoped he might one day stand, might one day say, "Enough." That hope kept me tethered far longer than it should have. I found him the evening after the newsletter incident in the estate library. The library was always his sanctuary, walnut shelves filled with old volumes, the faint smell of leather and bourbon, the fire burning low. He sat in his heavy chair, a glass of bourbon resting in his hand, a newspaper folded neatly on the side table. I walked in quietly, but he looked up, startled, as though he hadn't expected me to confront him. "Lucille," he said, forcing a smile. "I didn't hear you come in. Sit, sit." He gestured to a chair across from him. I didn't sit. "Why didn't you say anything?" I asked. He blinked, pretending confusion. "About what?" "The newsletter," I said. "About the fact that I was cut out of it again. About the fact that there's never a place for me. You never speak up. Not once." He shifted, bringing the bourbon to his lips, avoiding my gaze. "You're making more of this than you should. Your mother only meant—" "Stop." My voice was calm, but firm. "Don't hide behind her words. You've been silent for years. Silent when she erased me from stockings. Silent when she gave my speech to Rose. Silent when she cropped me out of photos. Do you know what that silence does to a daughter?" He folded the newspaper, buying himself time. "Lucille, families are complicated. Sometimes the best thing a man can do is keep the peace." "Peace?" I stepped closer, my voice low. "Peace for who? Not for me." He finally met my eyes then, and for a flicker of a second, I saw guilt. Heavy, tired guilt. He sighed and set the glass down, his shoulders slumping. "It was your grandmother's choice," he murmured. His voice was quiet, as if afraid the walls might hear. "She put the deed in your name." Years ago, I couldn't stop her. His words landed like a stone in my chest. My grandmother had given me the estate, and he had known. "You knew all this time?" I whispered. He nodded slightly. "Your mother. She never forgave that decision. She sees you as a threat because of it. I thought if I stayed quiet, if I didn't stir things, maybe the storm would pass." The room seemed to tilt. "You could have protected me. You could have told me the truth. Instead, you let them erase me while you sat there, pretending to read your paper." "Lucille, he said softly, his voice breaking. I wanted peace. I didn't want the house divided. I thought silence would hold things together. Silence doesn't hold things together, I shot back. It breaks them. It broke me. He looked down at his hands, old and trembling slightly. I was afraid, he admitted. Afraid of your mother, afraid of losing the family, afraid of more conflict. For a moment, I wanted to scream at him, to let out all the anger that had burned in me for decades. But instead, something colder and sharper came over me. Calm, deliberate clarity. You could have been my shield, I said quietly. Instead, you became my wall. He flinched as if the words had struck him physically. He tried to speak, but no words came. Only silence. The same silence that had followed me since childhood. I straightened. I don't need your defense anymore. I understand now. You won't give it. This fight is mine alone. As I turned to leave, I remembered a quote I once read, attributed to Dante. The hottest places in hell are reserved for those who, in times of moral crisis, maintain their neutrality. That was my father. Neutral, even when neutrality meant betrayal. I left the library with my heart heavy, but strangely freer than before. His silence no longer defined me. It revealed him. He thought his silence would bury me. He didn't see it was planting me instead. The estate glowed that night as though every chandelier in Charleston had been stolen and hung here. I arrived at the Legacy Gala dressed in my best evening gown, a modest navy dress that had taken weeks of saving to afford. The front steps were lined with cars polished like mirrors, and the doorman greeted guests with a smile that never quite reached me. Inside, the ballroom sparkled. Crystal chandeliers dripped from the ceiling, polished marble floors gleamed, and the air buzzed with strings from a live quartet. Women in gowns swept past with flutes of champagne, men laughed over old stories, and everywhere I turned, eyes followed me. Whispers trailed behind like smoke, low murmurs, glances exchanged, half smiles meant to sting. I made my way to the seating chart displayed near the entrance. My siblings' names were proudly placed at the head table beside my parents', their titles and accomplishments bold in black ink. I scanned lower, past rows of distant relatives and acquaintances, until I found mine. Lucille Vandermeer. Row 17, far from the stage, tucked against the edge. When I reached my table, my suspicion sharpened. It sat near the restroom doors, away from the light, close enough to hear the whoosh of every opening stall. The cards marked the seats of strangers, business partners I had never met, their spouses who eyed me with polite curiosity. The error wasn't an accident. It was deliberate, a quiet exile dressed as etiquette. A server leaned in, voice hushed. I'm sorry, ma'am. I don't assign the seating. He looked genuinely uncomfortable. I managed a small smile. It's all right, don't worry. But inside, the humiliation burned. I sat gracefully, keeping my chin lifted, though my stomach twisted. The guests around me exchanged careful glances. A man cleared his throat, finally breaking the silence. You're one of the Vandermeers, aren't you? I nodded once. I am. His wife leaned closer, lowering her voice. Why aren't you with your family up front? I swallowed, my smile steady though my heart hammered. Sometimes family decides where you don't belong, I said. The words tasted bitter, but I delivered them softly, as if I had rehearsed for this very question. The couple nodded awkwardly, unsure how to respond. I returned to my plate, pretending not to hear the quiet ripple of whispers moving down the table. The gala swelled around me, laughter louder than the quartet, speeches echoing off marble. I tried to focus on the clink of glassware, but then I noticed movement at the corner of the room. An organizer whispered urgently to a security guard, their eyes darting toward me. Within minutes, the guard approached. He bent down slightly, his tone respectful but firm. Ma'am, this event is private. We need to ask you to step outside. I froze, my blood running cold. I was invited, I whispered. My name is on the list. Right there, I gestured toward the seating chart. Guests at my table gasped softly, some leaning back, others leaning in to watch. The guard kept his voice calm, his eyes apologetic but unyielding. I understand, but I've been instructed to escort you out. For a moment, the room blurred, the chandeliers, the polished marble, the painted smiles. My heart screamed to protest, to stand and shout, but another voice inside reminded me, do not give them the satisfaction. I rose slowly, gathering the folds of my gown, my heels clicking against the floor as the guard led me toward the door. I felt eyes burning into me from every direction. My family remained at their table, not one of them rising. I caught my sister's smirk, my mother's cold glance, my father's eyes fixed firmly on his glass. The door opened, and the storm outside rushed in. Rain pelted down in sheets, drenching me instantly, streaking my makeup, plastering silk to my skin. The guard hesitated, as if he might apologize, but I shook my head faintly. It's not your fault, I whispered. Then the door shut behind me, sealing me out. I stood in the downpour, trembling as water seeped into my shoes, mascara bleeding onto my cheeks. Through the rain-streaked windows, I could see the glow of the ballroom. My siblings raised glasses in a toast, golden light glimmering around them. They were warm, applauded, while I shivered in darkness. The contrast struck me with brutal clarity. Outside, the storm raged, soaking me to the bone. Inside, false warmth shimmered, built on lies, theft, and erasure. I thought of an old American proverb. Sometimes the family you're born into blinds you to the strength you already carry. My hands tightened at my sides. They wanted me invisible. They wanted me to disappear into the storm, to dissolve into silence. But with every drop of rain that struck my skin, I felt resolve hardening within me. Humiliation no longer weakened me. It sharpened me. Through the window, my mother raised her glass higher, her eyes sliding toward me as though savoring her victory. No shame, no regret, only triumph. I whispered to myself, my voice steady despite the rain. They think they've erased me. They have no idea I still hold the pen. And as the storm poured down, I knew something had shifted. That night, in the rain, I stopped being erased. I started waiting for the moment to rewrite. I stepped back into the ballroom, my gown still clinging damp from the storm outside, but I refused to let them see me vanish like a shadow. I held my chin high, each stride measured. The music faltered slightly. Conversations broke off mid-sentence. I could feel the weight of eyes on me. Curious, judgmental, some amused, others quietly unsettled. Then her voice sliced through the murmurs. My mother, Delphine, did not lower her tone or veil her disdain. She stood, champagne flute in hand, and declared loud enough for the chandeliers to tremble. She doesn't belong here. She only craves attention. That's why we keep her outside. Gasps rippled across the room. A few guests covered their mouths, some smirked, reveling in the spectacle. My siblings shifted, but none intervened. My father studied his glass like it contained the answer to his cowardice. For a moment, the ground beneath me seemed to give way. Every humiliation I had endured condensed into that single declaration. Yet I remembered the voice inside me, the one that whispered not to break, not to let her have the victory of my collapse. My composure was my blade. I straightened, fixing my gaze on her, and gave nothing away. The bitterness was almost sweet, like medicine I had learned to swallow. She had abandoned the mask of civility she wore so proudly for others. Now the world could see her for who she was, a woman who erased her own daughter for the sake of image. And still, the crowd clapped for her. The lights dimmed, and the large projection screen flickered on. The gala's presentation began, a slideshow of family achievements. My stomach tightened, though I braced myself. First, photos of the charity events I had spent sleepless nights planning. Months of calls, spreadsheets, and endless hours went into those evenings. On screen, my sister Rose's face shone in sequins, the caption beneath crediting her for tireless leadership. Guests murmured admiration. "She's incredible." Such devotion. Next came the images of past galas, color palettes, seating charts, floral arrangements I had designed down to the last bloom. On screen, my brother Julian appeared beside the decor, the title reading, "His vision continues to guide our legacy." The knife twisted further. A photograph of my father during his recovery appeared, his fragile frame seated in a chair. Beside him knelt Rose, hand on his arm, smiling with devotion. But I remembered that month. I had been the one reading to him daily, coaxing him to eat, rebuilding his strength. The caption read, "Her devotion never wavered." My chest burned. Around me, voices swelled in admiration. "She's remarkable, isn't she? That family is unbreakable." Inside, my voice screamed, "They didn't just erase me. They stole my life and wore it like their own." Applause followed each slide, each fabrication. I clenched my fists beneath the tablecloth, nails digging crescents into my palms, but I did not storm out. I would not grant them the performance they wanted, a daughter unraveling in the corner. Instead, I breathed deeply, forcing my pulse to slow. I remembered a quote I once read, "The truth is like a lion. You don't have to defend it, let it loose, it will defend itself." I repeated it silently, anchoring myself. The humiliation throbbed through me, but beneath it, a new current stirred. They believed they were scripting my erasure, but they had underestimated me. Every stolen moment, every lie layered upon my silence, was ammunition I would someday release. As the slideshow concluded, I realized this wasn't chaos. It was choreography. Every omission, every staged photograph, every glossy newsletter, and now this spectacle, it was a performance with one clear objective: to remove me from the story entirely. And I was the role they had cut. But what they didn't know, what no one in that ballroom suspected, was that I held something they could not touch. The deed my grandmother entrusted to me, the weapon tucked quietly away, waiting for its moment. The applause roared as Rose accepted another toast. Glasses clinked, the crowd cheering. I leaned closer to my own glass of water, whispering to myself words no one else could hear. "Enjoy the spotlight while it lasts. Tomorrow, I flip the switch." That night, standing amid applause that did not belong to me, I understood humiliation was not my ending. It was only the prologue. The applause from the slideshow still rang in my ears when I returned to my table. My smile was a mask I had practiced over the years, carefully composed though my stomach churned. The air smelled faintly of champagne and roses, but underneath lingered something bitter, like the taste of old copper. I sat with deliberate calm, refusing to show even the smallest crack. That was when Rose appeared. She held a glass of red wine, her smile stretched wide, too sweet to be real. "Lucille," she cooed, "I didn't get to congratulate you. You managed to sit through all that with such grace." Her tone dripped with venom disguised as charm. She leaned closer as though to embrace me, and then her hand tilted ever so slightly. The wine spilled across my lap, the crimson liquid blooming like a wound against the navy fabric of my gown. I gasped at the icy shock soaking into the silk. Gasps followed from nearby tables, a wave of murmurs rising. "Oh dear," someone chuckled nervously. "Clumsy Lucille again," another whispered just loud enough for me to hear, "always making a scene." Rose placed her hand over her mouth in false horror. "Oh no, I'm so sorry. What a dreadful accident." Her eyes glinted with satisfaction, daring me to lash out. I felt heat creep up my neck, the humiliation searing me as much as the cold liquid. My body wanted to stand, to scream, to shove the glass back into her hand. But instead, I breathed slowly, forcing myself into control. I turned to her, my voice steady but sharp. "Don't worry, Rose," I said evenly, meeting her eyes. "Some stains never wash out." The words hung in the air like smoke. A few guests shifted uncomfortably, sensing the double meaning. Rose's smile faltered for a split second before she recovered, laughing lightly as though I were the joke. But I had seen the flicker, the tiny wound in her armor. I sat back down, dabbing uselessly at the fabric with a napkin, my hands trembling not from weakness but from restrained fury. I refused to give her the outburst she wanted. The room settled back into chatter, but I felt raw, like the stain had seeped into my skin. And then, just as I steadied myself, I felt a tug at my sleeve. I looked down and saw Mary Ann Jr., Rose's little girl, staring up at me with wide, innocent eyes. Her curls bounced as she tilted her head. "Excuse me," she asked sweetly. "Are you the babysitter?" The air left my lungs. The words pierced deeper than the wine ever could. Around us, the room erupted in polite laughter. Some covered their mouths, others exchanged knowing smirks, while a few looked away in embarrassment. My sister's friends whispered behind manicured hands. I froze, forcing my face into calm. The child blinked, waiting for an answer. Slowly, I knelt to her level, ignoring the fabric sticking wetly to my knees. I managed a smile, though my heart cracked in two. "No, sweetheart," I said softly. "I'm your Aunt Lucille." She frowned slightly, uncomprehending, before being whisked away by a distracted nanny. The laughter faded into background noise, but the damage was done. My own niece had not known who I was. My erasure was complete, not only from photos, newsletters, and speeches, but from the memory of the next generation. I sat back down heavily, staring at the stain blooming across my gown. My thoughts spiraled. Humiliation doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers in children's voices. Sometimes it comes wrapped in innocence, cutting sharper than cruelty. From stockings never hung, to photos cropped, to newsletters that skipped my name, it had all been building to this. I was no longer invisible just to my parents, my siblings, or their circle. I was invisible to their children. The audience clapped for another toast, but in my ears rang another quote, one I had read years ago. "First they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, then you win." Gandhi's words came back like a prophecy. They had ignored me, they were laughing now, and the fight was brewing. I wasn't asking for inclusion anymore. I was preparing for confrontation. Tears threatened to burn behind my eyes, but I clenched my fists beneath the table, nails digging deep. I would not give them the pleasure of seeing me break. "They wrote me out of their story," I told myself silently. But ink fades, truth does not. The storm outside beat against the windows, as though echoing my thoughts. I sat straighter, my breath steadying, fury shaping into resolve. I was done being erased. The girl who once searched desperately for her stocking, who smiled through cropped photographs, who clapped alone at her graduation, she was gone. Now, there was only me, sharpened by every humiliation. As applause echoed once more for Rose, I lifted my gaze and locked eyes with my mother. She sat regally at the head table, her expression cold, unmoved, approving silently of every humiliation I endured. The child's question wasn't her fault, it was the family's answer. And tomorrow, they would hear mine. That was the night I stopped asking for a seat. The next day, I would take the whole table, After the humiliation of the spilled wine and the sting of being mistaken for a stranger in my own bloodline, I felt raw, but I refused to vanish into the night. I lingered near the fringes of the ballroom, standing tall in the shadows, watching the swirl of gowns and tuxedos like I was observing a play from backstage. I had no intention of leaving. That was when my father appeared. He slipped toward me quietly, his voice lowered as if the chandeliers might overhear. "Lucille," he said, his hand half extended but not quite daring to touch me. "Come with me to the library. It's just a small formality." His eyes flickered, betraying him. He looked toward my mother, then toward Rose, who gave the faintest nod before returning to her admirers. My father's glance was all I needed. When people avoid your eyes, they've already betrayed you. Still, I followed. Some confrontations can only be met head-on, and I was done running from shadows. The library was exactly as I remembered. Dark walnut shelves stretching to the ceiling, the scent of aged leather, velvet drapes heavy with dust, portraits of long-dead ancestors glaring down with painted indifference. A room not for comfort, but for control. It was a chamber built for intimidation. Inside, my mother sat at the head of the long mahogany table, her posture immaculate, her smile a knife's edge. Rose lounged by the fireplace, her gown glittering as though mocking me, a smirk curled on her lips. My father remained near the door, half in, half out, as though he wanted the option of escape. At the center of the table lay a leather-bound folder, its presence too deliberate to ignore. "Lucille," my mother began, her voice smooth as silk stretched taut. "We wanted to settle a matter tonight, quietly, as a family. This," she gestured to the folder, "is just a small document, streamlining things for everyone's benefit." A technicality. I moved closer, resting my fingertips on the folder before opening it. My eyes scanned the first page. My heart clenched, but I forced my voice steady. "This document," I said slowly, "relinquishes all my rights to the estate. Every piece of land, every account, every claim. It makes Rose and Julian sole heirs." Silence. My pulse quickened. My mother's smile sharpened. "Why now?" I asked, my tone measured. "Why tonight?" Her eyes glittered cold. "Because tonight proves you don't belong here. Not in the newsletter, not at the gala, not at the table. You've always been the outsider, Lucille. Now it's time to make it official." Betrayal pressed down on me heavier than the library's walls. I realized then, the spilled wine, the public snub, the slideshow of lies, they were only Act 1. This was the finale they had scripted. I sat, sliding the pages closer. My eyes searched every line. The notary seal caught my attention first, the stamp uneven, blurred, almost laughably false. Then the date, 2 months ahead, sloppy, rushed, fabricated. Rose's voice broke the silence, mocking. "Just sign, Lucille. You've always been happier away from the spotlight. Let us carry the weight of the family. It's not your stage." I looked up at her, remembering my grandmother's quiet words to me years ago. "Always read the fine print. Silence is one thing. Signatures are forever." My mother's voice pressed again, cool and calculated. "You've never thrived here. You've always dragged us down. This is mercy, really. Give us your signature, and you'll be free." I leaned back, the weight of the generations glaring down from oil portraits surrounding me. Outrage bubbled, but I forced it into focus. I thought of the countless viewers who would know this pain, the wills rewritten behind closed doors, the inheritances stolen by manipulation, the children erased from legacies built on their backs. Slowly, deliberately, I closed the folder. Then, with calm precision, I slid it back across the polished wood. "If you want me erased," I said, my voice carrying evenly, You'll have to forge more convincingly than this." The words struck like a stone thrown into still water. Rose's smirk faltered. My mother's mask slipped, just for a fraction of a second, her eyes flashing with fury. My father closed his eyes, as though bracing for impact. I stood. My chair scraped the marble floor, echoing louder than any applause from the ballroom. "For years," I said, looking at each of them in turn, "I begged for your recognition. Tonight, I realize I don't need it. I don't need you. I need the truth. And that is something you can't take from me." I turned toward the door. My father half reached as if to stop me, but his hand dropped uselessly to his side. My mother's hiss followed me. "She knows too much. We should have dealt with her years ago." I paused in the hallway, the chill of her words crawling down my spine, but then my breath steadied. "They thought the library was their stage," I whispered to myself. "They forgot I was learning the script too." And as I walked back into the echoing corridors of the estate, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. By the time the night was over, it wouldn't be my signature on paper. It would be my name on the deed. The folder sat between us like a coiled snake. My mother's hand rested lightly on the cover, her nails painted in her signature crimson shade, her smile thin and sharp. Rose leaned casually against the fireplace mantel, the flames throwing gold into her sequined gown, her smirk growing with every second I didn't move. My father hovered near the door, eyes fixed anywhere but on me, as though if he didn't look directly, he could claim innocence. "Lucille," my mother began, her voice honeyed but hollow, "this is for the good of the family. We cannot afford division, not when the eyes of Charleston are always on us. This document is simply a matter of unity. Sign it, and everything will be settled." Rose laughed softly. "Honestly, Lucille, you've never fit in here. Maybe it's time to stop fighting what we all know. You'll be happier on your own, far away from the spotlight." I studied each of them carefully. My pulse pounded in my ears, but I forced myself to breathe evenly. This wasn't about paperwork. It was about erasure. Every omission, every cropped photo, every humiliation had led here, to a signature that would make their rewriting of history complete. I let the silence stretch until even my father shifted uncomfortably. Finally, I pulled the folder closer, flipped the cover open, and skimmed the words with deliberate care. My face betrayed nothing, though rage coiled in my stomach. When I reached the last page, I lifted my eyes and locked them on my mother. "No," I said. My voice was calm, steady, absolute. I slid the folder back across the table. "I will not sign away what is mine. Not tonight. Not ever." The room seemed to freeze. Rose's smirk shattered. She slammed her hand down on the table, rattling the crystal glassware. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," she snapped. My mother's eyes blazed cold. "Lucille, don't be foolish. Think carefully. A single signature buys peace, for you and for all of us." My father finally spoke, his voice low, almost apologetic. "You're making things difficult." I turned to him, my heart heavy but my tone controlled. "Strength isn't loud, Father. Sometimes it's just the word no, and tonight, that's my strength." Rose scoffed. "You think you're strong? You've spent your life begging for scraps of attention. Sign the paper, Lucille. Do something useful for once." I straightened in my chair. Peace built on erasure is not peace, it's a grave, and I will not dig it myself. The tension cracked. My mother's smile dropped entirely now, her mask slipping into raw contempt. "You'll regret this," she hissed. "We are offering you mercy." I stood, pushing my chair back slowly so the scrape echoed against the polished floor. Mercy is not theft dressed in velvet. Keep your peace. I'll find my own. Without waiting for a reply, I walked toward the door. My father shifted as if to stop me, but the weight of years pressed him back into silence. I left them in their stage set of lies, my heart pounding, but my resolve forged solid. In the hallway, the air felt cooler, freer. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from release. For the first time in years, I had refused them directly. My chest ached with adrenaline, but a quiet clarity pulsed inside me. As I rounded the corner, a figure stepped from the shadows. Barbara, the housekeeper who had been with the family since before I was born, moved toward me quietly. Her eyes darted toward the library door, then back at me. She leaned close, her voice a whisper no louder than the rustle of silk. "Your grandmother left something for you," she murmured. "Look in the cedar chest in the attic." I froze, my breath catching. Her eyes, steady and kind, met mine with urgency. "Do it tonight, before they move it." She wanted you to know. A rush of gratitude, sharp as sunlight, coursed through me. "Barbara," I whispered, my throat tightening. She shook her head quickly. "Don't thank me, just go, and be careful." She disappeared back into the shadows before I could say more. I stood still, the echo of her words reverberating through me. For the first time that night, hope flickered. Amid betrayal, there was a thread, a secret my grandmother had left, a lifeline waiting in cedar and dust. I turned my gaze back toward the muffled applause drifting from the ballroom. My siblings were being toasted again, their names ringing in cheers that weren't earned. But this time, I didn't feel hollow. I felt armed. "They thought I left empty-handed," I whispered to myself. They didn't see the whisper that followed me out the door. And as I walked toward the grand staircase leading to the attic, my heart no longer trembled. The next time I stepped into that ballroom, I wouldn't be asking for a seat, I'd be taking the floor. The attic was silent, except for the creak of the floorboards beneath my steps. Barbara's whisper still echoed in my ears as I pushed open the narrow door and climbed into the dim, dust-scented room. My heart pounded, not from fear, but from urgency. The house was a labyrinth of lies, yet I was being led by a truth hidden in cedar. The chest stood near the far wall, its wood darkened with age, carved with a floral motif my grandmother had always loved. I knelt beside it, brushing my fingers across its surface. The faint scent of cedar rose as I lifted the heavy lid, releasing decades of stored air. Inside were folded quilts, the kind she used to drape over our laps on winter nights. Beneath them, I found albums thick with photographs, some yellowed, some fading. My throat tightened when I saw myself in those pictures, proof I hadn't been invisible to her. She had kept what the others erased. Finally, beneath the layers, I uncovered a bundle wrapped in soft cloth. My breath caught when I saw her handwriting on the envelope. For Lucille. My hands trembled as I opened it, and there it was, the deed, my name inked clearly, a lifeline carved into paper. "She knew," I whispered. "She knew they would try to erase me. That's why she left me proof I existed." The tears that fell weren't of weakness, but of release. My grandmother had seen me when no one else did. She had protected me across time, through silence, with this document. Alongside the deed was a letter, folded carefully, her handwriting looping strong despite her age. I unfolded it and read aloud, my voice breaking at first, but growing steadier. "My dear Lucille, this house is not a monument to them, but an anchor for you. When storms come, and they will come, let this remind you, you belong. Do not let their noise drown your truth. This estate is yours not because of what you do, but because of who you are. When the moment arrives, stand. The blood in your veins is not theirs to erase." I pressed the letter to my chest, closing my eyes. Hope surged through me, replacing the humiliation of the evening. My armor was not silk or jewels, but these words, this truth. I have been erased 100 times, I whispered into the attic's stillness. But tonight, I will write myself back in. I tucked the deed and letter into a waterproof envelope I had carried, almost instinctively, in my clutch. My mind sharpened, no longer clouded by anger or shame. My steps felt deliberate, my spine unbowed. An old phrase I had once heard came to mind, one I now claimed for myself. Courage is being scared to death but saddling up anyway. John Wayne's words became my quiet mantra. Yes, I was afraid. But fear was fuel now. I glanced down at my gown, still damp and stained from the rain and the wine. It no longer looked ruined. It looked like battle armor. Every drop of water clinging to me, every crimson blotch, was a testament that I had endured. They thought I was walking away, I murmured. They had no idea I was circling back. The hallway stretched long as I descended from the attic, each step heavier with anticipation. The sound of music and laughter grew louder. My heart steadied. I reached the ballroom doors, their polished surface reflecting the glow of chandeliers within. I placed one hand on the handle, pushed them open, and the room fell into silence. The string quartet faltered, glasses froze mid-air, conversations broke apart like fragile glass. Every eye turned toward me. Whispers rippled like wind through wheat. Rosa's smile faltered, freezing in place. My mother's eyes narrowed, sharp as daggers. My father shrank lower in his chair, his hands gripping the tablecloth. A guest near the front dropped a glass of wine. It shattered, red spilling across the marble like a wound. No one moved to clean it. They all just stared. I stepped forward, the envelope in my hands feeling heavier than any crown. My voice, calm and clear, cut through the silence. "You've had your turn to speak," I said, my gaze sweeping across the room. "Now it's mine." The murmurs died completely. My siblings stiffened, their faces pale. My mother's fingers tightened around her glass, the mask of control cracking. "They paraded lies as truth," I continued, raising the envelope slightly. "Tonight, I will let the truth march in on its own 2 feet." I held the deed aloft, the parchment glinting under the chandelier light. My words came not as rage, but as revelation. "The deed in my hand isn't just paper," I declared. "It's the storm you never saw coming." The chandeliers above shimmered like frozen stars, and for a moment I could hear nothing but the sound of my own heartbeat. I stood in the center of the ballroom, soaked gown clinging to me, strands of damp hair trailing my shoulders. Guests gasped at my reappearance, some whispering, "Didn't she get thrown out?" Others exchanged nervous glances, clutching their champagne flutes tighter. Rose forced out a brittle laugh that echoed off the marble, a performance meant to mask her unease. My mother's eyes narrowed into sharp lines, cutting through me as though she could erase me with a glance. My father shrank further into his chair, shoulders rounded, gaze sinking toward the tablecloth. But I held my ground, unmoved. My calm presence was a weapon sharper than any shout. Though my pulse thundered, I did not falter. I wanted them to see me standing tall, unshaken, a woman who had walked through humiliation and come back stronger. For the first time that night, the spotlight wasn't theirs. It was mine. I walked to the podium, the same one my siblings had used earlier to claim my work as their own. I placed the waterproof envelope on it, the sound of paper against wood carrying through the stillness. My voice was clear, steady. "You've told your version of the story," I said, scanning the crowd. "Now here's mine." I opened my grandmother's letter, her handwriting steady even with age, her words a balm and a blade all at once. I read aloud. This estate belongs to my granddaughter, Lucille, the one who sees truth where others perform lies. Gasps rippled like thunder. A murmur swelled, guests turning their heads, eyes widening as the words sank in. I lifted the deed from the envelope, holding it high so every guest, every doubter, every thief could see. My name is written here, not cropped out, not erased. It is mine. The silence broke into murmurs. Some guests whispered, "She has the deed." Others leaned away from my mother, as if her composure might crack and stain them too. Rose lunged forward, her voice sharp with panic. "This is fake! She forged it! Don't believe her!" I turned toward her slowly. "Funny," I said, my tone like glass. "That's what you handed me earlier tonight. A fake. Rushed, sloppy, desperate. If anyone in this room should be accused of forgery, it's you." Gasps turned to open stares. A few guests covered their mouths, others whispered with urgency. My father finally muttered, just loud enough for the front row to hear, "It's true. Her grandmother left it to her." His half-confession, dragged into the light. My mother remained seated, her face carved from stone, but her silence was louder than any denial. Guests watched her, waiting for a rebuttal that never came. The mask she had worn for decades was cracking under the weight of the truth. I gripped the podium, letting the power of stillness steady me. My voice carried across the room, deliberate and cutting. "You erased me from your newsletters, your photos, your speeches, but you cannot erase me from the truth. This estate is mine, and tonight the lies end here." The ballroom froze. Not a clap, not a whisper, just the heavy weight of silence pressing in. Vindication came not in cheers, but in the stillness of a crowd, realizing everything they thought they knew had been a lie. I let the silence linger, filling the corners of the room. Vindication didn't need applause. Dignity doesn't roar. It stands quietly until the truth has no choice but to be seen. Then I looked directly at my mother. Her eyes, cold and sharp, met mine. For once, she didn't look away. I felt my voice steady, anchored by every humiliation I had endured. "You told me there was no space for me," I said, my words cutting clean. "Tonight, I make space." I closed the folder with a final, echoing snap. Then I stepped back from the podium, leaving the room in a silence deeper than any orchestra could ever play. For the first time in my life, they had nothing left to say. The silence that followed my declaration in the ballroom was thick enough to drown in. I could feel every pair of eyes on me, waiting to see whether I would falter. My mother shifted in her chair at the head table, her lips parting as if to deliver a retort. But for the first time in my life, her words stumbled. Rage twisted her face, but no sound carried across the marble floor. Her hand trembled slightly against the stem of her glass. I took a step closer, meeting her eyes without hesitation. "You erased me for decades," I said, my voice even but sharp enough to cut. "Tonight, I erased your lie." Gasps swept the room, followed by whispers, heads turning from me to her. Some guests looked at my mother with pity, but most turned away in disgust. I felt the shift as surely as if the chandeliers had swung overhead. The power she had wielded for so long was gone. For the first time, I realized I no longer feared her silence, her stare, her control. That grip had broken. The murmurs grew louder, turning into a wave that rolled across the ballroom. Guests began shifting away from the family table, chairs scraping against marble. A prominent guest muttered aloud, "I had no idea, all this time." His voice carried, making others nod in agreement. Rose slammed her chair back, her face crimson. She stormed toward the exit, the glitter of her gown trailing like a comet, but not one ally followed her. The room that once bent to her charm now watched her leave with raised brows and folded arms. Business partners slipped their phones into pockets, unwilling to be seen at her side. My brothers exchanged a glance, pale with the realization that their allies were vanishing into the crowd like smoke. My mother's smile broke finally, cracking into a grimace. She looked down, her hands trembling slightly. My father bowed his head, not in reverence but in defeat. The predators were tasting what I had swallowed for years: exile, isolation, shame. I stood taller, filling the silence with my voice once more. "This is my home," I said clearly, letting the weight of the words anchor in the air. "This event is over. You have 1 hour to leave." Gasps erupted. A few hands clutched pearls, others glanced nervously toward the exits, but not a soul dared challenge me. Behind me, I heard the faint clink of glassware. The staff had already begun quietly removing champagne flutes, folding napkins, signaling the evening's end. They didn't look to my mother for instruction. They looked to me. That was the moment I understood. I was no longer the erased daughter. I was the authority in the room. My mother slumped into her chair, shoulders heavy, her empire collapsing beneath her. My father's head drooped lower, as though he wanted to disappear into the floor. And I, for the first time, felt whole. Weeks later, I sat in the same estate, but it no longer felt like a mausoleum of humiliation. I had made my decision, not to keep it as a crown for myself, but to transform it into something bigger, something healing. The mansion would become a foundation, a sanctuary for young adults who had been cast out or erased by their own families. "They built walls to keep me out," I said during the announcement, my voice steady before a new gathering of community members and press. I turned those walls into doors for others. The estate's heavy halls rang with new sounds: laughter, footsteps of people finding safety, stories being told without fear of erasure. The house that had been a prison for me became a shelter for others. I had broken the cycle. One evening, alone in my study, I took out paper and wrote a letter, not to my family, but to myself. "Dear Lucille, you are not what they erased. You are what you built. You are enough. Thank you for choosing to stand, even when silence weighed more than words. Thank you for walking back into that ballroom, for reclaiming your truth without waiting for theirs. You are not the absence they wrote. You are the story you have written." I folded the letter carefully, placed it inside the same cedar chest where my grandmothers had once waited for me, and closed the lid. For the first time, my story was mine, and I was finally home.